She set down the last fork, stepped back from the table, and did not know that in 70 years, no one in her family would ever set a table this way again. What did the American dinner party know that we forgot? This is Clara's Forgotten Parlor. And if you have ever wondered why your grandmother's dinner parties felt like an event and yours feel like an obligation, the answer is not talent. It is structure. Somewhere between her generation and ours, an entire system of hosting got quietly dismantled, one small ritual at a time, and nobody wrote down what we were losing while we lost it. Start with the room itself. Before the war, most American homes did not have a space built purely for entertaining guests. The post-war building boom changed that fast, putting up roughly 15 million new homes between 1945 and 1955, many of them designed around one deliberate feature: a living room meant to be seen. Levittown, New York, broke ground in 1947 and eventually held about 17,400 homes, each one built around a defined living and dining space instead of a cramped city apartment layout. For the first time at this scale, an ordinary family could own a room whose entire purpose was hosting. That single architectural shift is where this whole story quietly begins. Now picture the woman standing in that new living room on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before her guests arrive. She is not improvising. She is working from a schedule because the etiquette manuals of the era did not just describe good manners, they gave hostesses an actual timeline. 3 days out, the silver got polished. The day before, the flowers were arranged. This was logistics, not luck. Here is the first thing we lost, and it might surprise you. The 1950s dinner party was not effortless, it was rehearsed. Emily Post's Etiquette, first published in 1922 and revised again in 1945, 1950, and 1955, gave women a script for nearly every moment of the evening, and that script is exactly what let the evening feel effortless to the guests. The ritual was never written down in any single place a young bride could just memorize, but every good hostess knew it by heart because she had watched it performed her whole life before she ever hosted a single dinner. That is the piece we lost first, not the china, not the recipes, the apprenticeship of simply watching someone else do it well. In 1952, a second rulebook arrived to compete with Post's. Amy Vanderbilt published her complete book of etiquette, and it became one of the most given wedding and shower gifts of the decade. Two competing authorities, each claiming the correct way to fold a napkin or seat a table, sometimes disagreeing with each other in print. Even the experts were arguing over the details. That rivalry matters more than it sounds like it should, because it tells you something real. Even in the so-called golden age of entertaining, hostesses were reaching for outside authority to tell them what to do. This was not instinct passed down effortlessly through the blood. It was a skill people studied on purpose, the way you might study a language. So let's set the scene properly. It is early evening in a suburban American house, sometime in the mid-1950s, and the cocktail hour is about to begin. The husband has just come home from the commuter train, the children have been sent upstairs, and the entire evening is about to unfold according to a structure so precise it could be timed with a kitchen clock. The cocktail hour itself, usually running from 6 to 7 in the evening, was not just a warm-up act before dinner. It was a deliberately built social buffer, timed to the exact hour husbands walked in from work, designed to soften the transition from the office day into the evening's performance. Nobody called it a strategy, but that is exactly what it was. Offering a guest a drink the moment they walked through the door solved a problem that still exists at every party today. The first, awkward 60 seconds where nobody knows what to do with their hands. The 1950s solved it with ritual. You handed someone a glass, and their hands and the silence had somewhere to go. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works. Think about the last party you went to where someone handed you a drink the second you walked in the door, before you even had time to feel out of place. That small gesture, So common that it barely registered as manners, is now rare enough to feel like genuine hospitality when it happens. Now let's talk about the table itself, because this is where modern viewers usually assume the whole thing was pure excess. A formal 1950s dinner setting could include up to 3 forks, 2 knives, 2 spoons, a butter knife, and several glasses depending on the courses being served. That sounds absurd today. It was not decoration, it was a map. Every piece of silverware told a guest exactly what was coming next and exactly which tool to use for it, without a single word needing to be spoken. Work from the outside in, and you would never once look confused in front of your host. It was, in a strange way, one of the kindest systems ever designed. It removed the guesswork from being a guest. Compare that to hosting today. A 2023 advisory from the United States Surgeon General named loneliness and isolation an actual public health epidemic, and one of the quieter threads inside that conversation is how many Americans now say they feel too unsure of the rules to even invite people over. We didn't just lose the extra forks, we lost the confidence that came with knowing what to do with them. Let's go back to the kitchen, because the food on that table was solving its own quiet problem. By the mid-1950s, about 80% of American homes had a refrigerator, and that single appliance changed what a hostess could serve. Make-ahead dishes became possible for the first time at scale, and one dish in particular became the decade's unofficial signature. The molded gelatin salad, the one modern viewers love to mock in old photographs, was not a joke to the woman who made it. It required a working refrigerator, careful timing, and a steady hand to unmold without collapse. Serving a perfect aspic quietly announced two things about a household at once: that it had modern appliances and that its hostess had genuine skill. It functioned the same way a soufflé functions in French cooking. It could fail publicly in front of guests in a way that could not be hidden. So bringing a flawless one to the table was a small, edible proof of competence. We lost that too. Almost nothing we serve today is judged quite that openly, and honestly, maybe that took some of the stakes out of cooking for company. Jell-O, for its part, was not a passive bystander in all this. Its 1950s recipe booklets, handed out in stores and printed in magazines, actively trained American women to build entire salad courses around a single product. It is one of the earliest, most effective examples of a food company manufacturing a tradition and having it adopted as folk wisdom within a few short years. Now, the seating chart. This is where the real genius of the 1950s hostess starts to show, because she was not just arranging chairs, she was engineering conversation. Etiquette manuals instructed hostesses to deliberately separate married couples at the table, seating husbands and wives apart on purpose so that every guest had to actually talk to someone new. Think about what that actually accomplished. It forced fresh conversation instead of letting couples retreat into their own private shorthand for the whole evening. It meant a quiet neighbor might end up seated next to someone who could draw her out. This was not decoration or tradition for tradition's sake. This was a hostess actively directing the emotional temperature of her own room. And if a conversation started to lag, the hostess had a job to do right there at the table. She was taught to redirect a question toward the quietest guest, gently pulling them back into the evening before anyone noticed they had gone silent. That is real social skill, practiced and repeated until it became instinct. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home. This is worth pausing on, because it corrects something people get wrong about this whole era. The common assumption is that women had no real power inside these homes. But within the walls of her own dinner party, the hostess held enormous, codified authority. She decided who sat where. She controlled the pacing of every course. Nobody else in the house made those calls. Running a flawless evening was one of the few arenas where a woman's competence got judged openly, publicly, and rewarded with real social standing. That does not erase the limits placed on women in that decade, but it is a piece of the story that flattening the era into one simple narrative tends to leave out entirely, and it deserves better than that. Let's talk about the invitation itself, because even that small piece of paper carried real weight. Etiquette books of the period treated a written RSVP as close to mandatory, expected within a matter of days of receiving an invitation, not a text back whenever you got around to it. A note written by hand, sent promptly, because leaving your host wondering was considered a genuine social failure. That single expectation solved a headache every modern host still faces, not knowing how many people are actually coming until the last possible minute. The 1950s hostess planned her menu, her seating, and her budget around numbers she could actually trust, because the culture made an unanswered invitation genuinely embarrassing rather than an easy thing to ignore. There is also the matter of what a guest brought with them. The hostess gift, something small like flowers, chocolates, or a bottle of wine, was near mandatory etiquette by the 1950s, far more consistently observed then than it tends to be now. It was a guest's way of acknowledging the labor they were about to receive before a single course had even been served. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Nobody photographed the RSVP cards or kept the hostess gift wrapping paper. Those small, unglamorous objects were the connective tissue of the entire ritual, and they simply were not considered worth preserving at the time, which is exactly why we forget they existed at all. Now let's step back to something viewers often assume incorrectly, which is that all of this, the multiple forks, the calling cards, the dance cards, was universal 1950s practice everywhere in the country. It was not. Formal calling cards, that old custom of leaving an engraved card during a social visit, had already faded for most middle-class families by this decade. Even the etiquette writers of the era described calling cards as old-fashioned, a custom their own mothers had practiced, not something most 1950s women were doing themselves. A softened version survived in pockets, older Southern and East Coast social circles mostly, as printed at home cards indicating open visiting hours, but it was already, even then, a fading practice. Here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. The 1950s women we think of as living inside some untouchable golden age of manners were themselves nostalgic for an even earlier, pre-war formality they felt they had already lost. Every generation, it turns out, is quietly mourning the generation before it. That is not a flaw in this story. That is the whole story. Same with formal dance cards and cotillion culture. Those survived through the 1950s mostly in debutante circles, in cities like Charleston and New Orleans, and pockets of the Northeast, tied tightly to a specific social class rather than practiced by the country as a whole. It is worth being honest about that nuance, because this channel owes you the real picture, not a flattened postcard. Now back to the ordinary suburban dinner party, because this is where the real democratization happened. The post-war building boom, the mass-produced wedding china sets, the affordable printed etiquette guides, all of it put a version of formal entertaining within reach of a middle-class family for arguably the first time in American history. This was not only for the wealthy anymore. A young bride in a brand-new tract home outside Cleveland or Dallas or Sacramento could, for the first time, own her own matched china, her own set of silver, her own copy of Vanderbilt or Post, and host a dinner party that would have been unimaginable for a family of her income a generation earlier. That is a genuinely remarkable shift, and it rarely gets credit. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because they help ground this in something real. Median household income in the mid-1950s sat somewhere around $4,400 to $4,900 a year. Against that backdrop, a properly hosted dinner party with food, flowers, and a bottle or two of good liquor was a real but manageable expense for an ordinary family, not an extravagance reserved for the rich. That affordability is a key piece of why this ritual spread so widely and so fast. It was not gate-kept by wealth the way formal entertaining had been for generations before. A school teacher's wife and a bank manager's wife could both host a proper dinner party on the same Saturday night with more or less the same rulebook, and both evenings would be judged by more or less the same standard. Now let's take a detour into something that gets remembered today mostly as a punchline: the Tupperware party. It began with Earl Tupper's invention of the plastic container in 1946, but the ritual that made it famous was built by one woman, and her story deserves far more attention than it usually gets on this channel's kind of subject. Brownie Wise was a divorced single mother who built the entire home party sales model between 1949 and 1951, and in 1951, she convinced the company to pull Tupperware off store shelves completely, selling it exclusively through parties held in ordinary women's living rooms. By 1954, annual Tupperware party sales reportedly topped $25 million, an enormous figure for a business built entirely on invitations and coffee cups. In 1954, Brownie Wise appeared on the cover of Businessweek and became one of the first female corporate vice presidents in the entire country. She had turned a woman's existing hosting skill, the ability to fill a living room with guests and guide an evening smoothly, into a real, respected economic engine at a time when very few career paths were open to women at all. The Tupperware party is often remembered today as a kitschy suburban punchline, all pastel plastic and burping lids. But look closer, and it was a genuine feminist economic innovation, built entirely on the premise that hosting was a marketable skill. That template, the party plan built around one hostess and her living room, went on to shape Mary Kay, Avon's expansion, and dozens of companies after it. So even the most mocked ritual of this era, the plastic bowl party, was solving a real problem the same way the dinner party was, turning the private, invisible labor of running a household into something visible, valuable, and shared. That thread runs through nearly everything we are talking about today. Hosting was never just decoration. It was infrastructure. Let's return to the dinner table one more time, because there is a detail worth sitting with. Smoking was near universal at these gatherings, and a good hostess was expected to have ashtrays placed at every seating area, sometimes with a matching cigarette box and table lighter set out as part of the decor. This is not a ritual to romanticize. It is simply what the room looked like. We mention it because an honest history channel does not edit out the parts of the past that make us uncomfortable. Attitudes changed for good reason, and this channel is not here to tell you the old days were better in every single way. It is here to tell you what actually happened and to let you decide what is worth bringing back and what is not. So, what actually started pulling this whole structure apart? The first crack came from an unlikely source, sitting right there in the same living room. By 1954, television ownership had crossed 50% of American households, and by the end of the decade, it was pushing toward 90%. The very room built for gathering guests slowly gained a second, quieter purpose. At first, television was itself a social draw. Neighbors came over specifically to watch a new set, crowding onto the sofa together for a boxing match or a variety show. But watching a screen and hosting a dinner party ask two very different things of a room, and over time the screen started winning more evenings than the seating chart did. By the late 1950s, a second, more casual competitor had also arrived: the backyard barbecue. Postwar suburbs came with real backyards, new charcoal grills, and outdoor patio furniture, and entertaining began splitting into two tracks: the formal indoor dinner party and the relaxed outdoor cookout. The casual version was easier, cheaper, and required none of the seating charts or extra forks. You can already see where this is heading. Once a genuinely easier version of hosting existed side by side with the formal one had to justify its own extra effort every single time, and effort that has to keep justifying itself eventually stops happening as often. The backyard barbecue did not kill the dinner party outright. It just made it optional. Then came the 1960s, and with it a real generational shift. Younger homemakers, raised watching their mothers execute the formal script, started moving toward looser buffet-style entertaining instead. It was less about rejecting the past and more about time. Second-wave feminism and rising numbers of women working outside the home meant fewer hours available for a ritual that had always demanded days of preparation. By the 1970s, fondue parties and drop-in casual entertaining had become the norm, and printed place cards and multi-course formal dinners had become rare outside wealthy households or older generations still holding on to the old rules. The rulebook did not vanish overnight. It faded gradually, one busier decade at a time, the way most traditions actually end. The next major hit came from the kitchen itself. Microwave ovens spread through American homes in the 1980s. Two-income households became the norm rather than the exception, and takeout and delivery culture kept expanding from there. Each of these changes was, on its own, a genuine convenience. Together, they steadily drained the hours a household had available to prepare an elaborate evening for guests. By the 2000s and into the 2010s, something worth naming clearly had emerged in surveys and lifestyle coverage: a documented reluctance among younger Americans to host at all, often described as hosting anxiety. People reported feeling they lacked the dishware, the skills, or the space to invite others over, a direct and almost painful inversion of the 1950s assumption that every young wife would simply know how. That is the real distance we are measuring here. Not just fewer forks on the table, but a genuine loss of confidence about what hosting even requires. The 1950s hostess had a script memorized so thoroughly she never had to think about it consciously. Her granddaughters, in many cases, do not have a script at all, and that absence is heavier than it sounds. Let's pause here on the receiving line and the seating chart together, because they solved a problem that has never actually gone away. What do you do with guests who do not know each other? The 1950s answered with structure, assigned seats, a hostess actively directing conversation. Modern casual entertaining mostly does not answer that question at all, and that is a big part of why it can feel harder despite so much less formal effort. Think about the last party where you did not know most of the room. Nobody assigned you a seat. Nobody redirected the conversation your way when you went quiet in the corner. You were simply expected to manage all of that yourself, in real time, with no script at all. The 1950s hostess would have found that arrangement almost shockingly rude to her guests. So why does any of this matter right now in the summer of 2026? Because this is not a closed historical question. The Surgeon General's 2023 Loneliness Advisory has continued to shape public conversation for years since, and multiple surveys through the mid-2020s have tracked declining rates of in-person socializing and shrinking friend groups compared to prior generations. We are quietly and without much fanfare living through the long tail of exactly the shift we have been tracing this whole video. Fewer built rituals, fewer scripts to lean on, more isolation than researchers have documented in decades. The dinner party did not just disappear because it went out of fashion. It disappeared because nothing structured ever fully replaced it. And here is the hopeful part, because this channel is never here just to grieve. Lifestyle coverage through 2023, 2024, and into 2025 has repeatedly noted a real, if small, dinner party revival among younger Americans, structured no-phones dinners, formal-ish hosting nights, deliberate reactions against a life lived mostly through screens. The pullback toward this ritual is already underway. That is not a coincidence, and it is not nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It is people, without necessarily knowing the history behind it, rediscovering the exact same solution the 1950s hostess reached for: structure lowers social anxiety. A script, even an informal modern one, still does the same quiet job her seating chart once did. Let's talk about one more misconception before we bring this home, because it is the one that bothers me most. People assume all of this etiquette was about status competition, about impressing the neighbors and nothing more. Some of it certainly was, but a large share of the actual etiquette writing from this era frames hosting explicitly as a duty of care toward the guest. Every rule, the seating, the timing of courses, the offered drink at the door, existed to make a guest feel taken care of the moment they cross the threshold. That is worth sitting with. The rules were not primarily about showing off. They were, underneath all the forks and the flowers, about making sure nobody in that room ever had to wonder if they were welcome. Now picture that same living room decades later, and a young woman today wanting to throw her first real dinner party. She has no etiquette manual passed down to her, no mother who hosted every month to learn from by watching. What she has instead is an old photograph, a half-remembered story, and a genuine desire to make her guests feel the way people once felt walking into that 1950s parlor. She does not need 3 forks or an engraved calling card to get there. What she needs is the underlying idea, structure as an act of kindness, a drink offered at the door, a seat assigned so no guest stands around wondering where to go. A host who is actually paying attention to the quiet person in the corner. That is the whole secret, stripped down to its bones. Let's talk briefly about what a modern version of this could genuinely look like, because I promised you depth, not just longing. It does not require matched china or a formal seating chart with place cards. It requires deciding on purpose who sits where. It requires greeting a guest with something in their hand within the first minute. Small, deliberate choices, not elaborate rules. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, and that phrase is not just a nice line to close a video on. It is the actual tested thesis of everything we have walked through today. Structure is not the opposite of warmth. Structure is very often what makes warmth possible in a room full of people who do not yet know each other well. Let's zoom back out one more time to that woman we started with, setting the last fork down on her table decades ago. She had no idea that the ritual she was performing so casually, so automatically, would be nearly extinct within 2 generations. She was not preserving history on purpose. She was just hosting a Tuesday dinner the way she had been taught. That is what makes this era worth studying honestly, rather than either worshiping it or dismissing it entirely. It was not a perfect golden age, and it was not a cautionary tale either. It was a working system, built by ordinary women out of etiquette books, refrigerators, and careful attention, and it genuinely did what it was built to do. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Not just the china patterns and the tablecloths, but the timing, the choreography, the small acts of attention that turned an ordinary Tuesday into something guests still remembered years later. That is what got lost first, quietly, before anyone even noticed it was going. And that brings us to the real invitation of this whole video, because this channel has never been about admiring the past from behind glass. The parlor remembers, even when we forget, and the good news is that remembering is available to anyone willing to try it, starting with something as small as one dinner for a few people, planned on purpose. You do not need 3 forks. You do not need a printed calling card or a formal receiving line. You need one decision made ahead of time about where each person will sit, one drink or one small gesture offered the moment someone walks through your door, and one quiet promise to yourself that you will notice the guest standing alone in the corner. That is the entire secret this video set out to find, and it turns out it was never really lost at all. It was just buried under decades of convenience, screens, and the quiet assumption that hosting well required some talent we simply were not born with. It required a system. Systems can always be rebuilt, one dinner at a time. So here is where I will leave you tonight. Somewhere in a box in an attic, or folded into a grandmother's recipe card, or simply remembered in the shape of a story someone told you once. There is a piece of this ritual still waiting to be picked back up. It was never written down in full, but it was never really gone either. If this brought back a memory of your own mother's table or your grandmother's parlor, I would love to hear it in the comments below. Tell me what her dinner parties actually looked like, what was on her table, what rule she never broke. This channel exists because of stories exactly like that, and I read every single one of them. Thank you for spending this evening in the parlor with me. If you want more of these forgotten rituals brought back into the light, subscribe and join me next time, because there is always another room, another table, another story waiting to be remembered here at Clara's Forgotten Parlor.